So, what is Luke Acts literary structure? Well, first of all, when I talk about Luke, I can't talk about Luke without talking about Acts. They're joined at the hip. In fact, I would be among those that would think of Luke Acts as just volume one and volume two of a two-volume work. It was never intended to be only Luke, and then after a little while, he says, "You know what? I should probably write something about what these apostles are doing too." And it's disconnected. No, there seems to be an historical, literary, and a theological agenda that permeates both. Here are some examples. In the Gospel of Luke, you get the story of Jesus. In the book of Acts, you get the story of the apostles. They are two-sided. In fact, the book of Acts begins with these words, all that Jesus began to do and teach. I told you, Theophilus. Theophilus is the intended recipient of this book of Acts and the book of Luke as well. In the former account, I told you everything that Jesus began to do and teach. Now that implies something to us. It implies that what was started in the gospel is continued, and as we see it developed, it's not continued by Jesus himself, but it is continued by those who spent time with him. It is continued by the apostles. While in the book of Luke, you have this work of Jesus in healing and preaching and those kinds of things. In the book of Acts, you have the work of the Spirit. So certainly the apostles are saying the words, but it's clear as we read the book of Acts that it is under the inspiration of the Spirit. In fact, this is the same Spirit that impelled Jesus to do his work if you read Luke chapter 4. One of the other things that we see in terms of the literary structure and the dynamics of Luke and Acts is in Luke there's this movement. Luke really is interested in Old Testament history in a way that's different than Matthew, different than John. Mark doesn't talk a whole lot about Old Testament history, but Luke has this movement from the Old Testament priesthood, which is actually where it even begins in the first couple of chapters, to the metropolitan, diverse capital city of Rome. From Jerusalem to Rome, from priesthood to cosmopolitanism. And even at the end of the Gospel of Luke, in anticipation of what's going to happen next, says, okay, you guys need to wait here in Jerusalem for the promise of the Father. In Acts chapter 1, that was Luke 24. Pardon me. In Acts chapter 1, we find out what that promise of the Father is. In Acts chapter 1 and certainly in Acts chapter 2, the coming of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, immediately after Jesus' ascension. Well, I say immediately, but it's like 10 days later. One of the other things that we see in Luke and Acts is geography plays a part. For Luke, geography is important. This is one of the things that binds the two books together. As you can see already, you're like, wow. If you're not familiar with this kind of way of reading religious text, you're probably thinking, man, this is not something that I've thought about before. I've looked at the Bible, some of us very often, we've just looked at the Bible for a little bit of inspiration here and there. Not this kind of literary structure and history and geography and how that all plays into things. And so if this is a little uncomfortable for you, I get that, I understand that. Don't let it be off-putting to you, because one of the things that the people that do what I do want to talk about is how do we read the Bible as literature? How do we just read it as a book? And then let the theology, let the spirituality, let the ethics, let that bubble up from reading it as a book first. And I think it's alive. I think it's a vibrant way to do it. But if you haven't done it this way before, I understand it can be, again, a little off-putting. So geography is important to Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, we see this movement toward Jerusalem. Everything is getting toward Jerusalem. It's toward the locus of that city. In the book of Acts, though, it's a movement away from Jerusalem. It's a movement out into other cities and ultimately to Rome. This presages the most important theological controversy of the first century, and that is what to do with guys like me. What do I mean by that? What to do with Gentiles, those who are not Jewish by birth, and yet the message of the gospel goes to them, and they accept the message of the gospel. The big controversy is, do they have to become Jewish first? In the New Testament, certainly in the book of Acts, they're dealing with that question in Acts 15, but in other areas as well. I think the whole book of Romans has something to do with that. I think much of 1 Corinthians does. Certainly the book of Hebrews speaks to that, where there is this question, how do we include these people whom God has obviously included? And that's part of the conversation that Simon Peter has in Acts chapter 15. Pretty important chapter. Now, again, there are other approaches than this kind of historical critical approach. One of the approaches that I especially value, because my wife, who is an RN, helps me see things in the text that I don't see. I really appreciate a woman's eyes on the text. There is a passage in the book of Judges that is, it's one of those texts that Phyllis Tribble, Old Testament theologian, called text of terror, as this woman, a concubine, some question about what concubine really means. I'm kind of convinced that concubine probably means something more akin to non-resident wife than sexual partner with no kind of wifely rights. Be that as it may, she's brutalized and killed. And so my wife and I were talking about this particular text. This was, my goodness, 12, 15 years ago, and I still remember it so clearly. And I asked Sue, how does that text make you feel? I was prepared for her to say what I was thinking: outrage, anger, frustration, the thirst for justice. And she said, unsafe. And I realized in that moment that what she saw in the text was something I couldn't see in the text because of the limitations of my own blinders. And that was fundamentally important for me. So I need, not that I don't need all kinds of other kind of voices on the text, but I know for me, the value that has been contributed by getting a woman's eyes on the text that sees things that I miss. They're there, I just miss them. And because of that, when I read Luke and Acts, I try to be especially sensitive to the way Luke portrays Jesus dealing with women. And it seems to be the case that in Luke and Acts, women play a much more prominent place than they do in the other Gospels. It's not to slight the other Gospels. Mary's place in Luke is much more pronounced and valued than it is in the Gospel of Matthew, for example. It's not that she's devalued, but her influence, her reception and willingness to be the servant of God, which is a term used of Mary in Luke chapter 1 and 2, that is only used of like prophets and kings and Moses in the Old Testament. That is significant. So, this is something that that I'm especially interested in. I'm really interested in the way Luke uses the Old Testament. I'm interested in the way the book of Judges kind of forms this background for Acts. I'm interested in the way Luke uses the prophet Isaiah in Luke chapter 4. You could look at a very popular text, the Magnificat in Luke chapter 1, verses 46 to 55, and really get some interesting ideas about how Luke is going to be approaching the Old Testament, women, and justice issues. So we'll come back in just a few minutes and begin diving into some text.